So we've gotten an important new update in a state rifle and magazine ban case, and it tells you a lot about how serious this fight is currently getting. So the plaintiffs brought in the Benson ruling to the 7th Circuit, they brought it to their attention, and Illinois immediately responded, and their filings make it very clear that they do not want this court relying on Benson. Because if the 7th Circuit takes that ruling seriously, it puts real pressure on Illinois and their ability to defend its magazine ban and potentially the entire PICA framework. So today let's talk about what's currently going on in the Illinois PICA case dealing with rifle bans and magazine bans and how it's being impacted by what's going on in Washington, DC. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to give you as much as possible as a member. So if you're interested, if you want to check them out, you can do so using the links down below. And if you sign up using the code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $25 off of your sign-up fee. So as you guys know, this case is called Barnett versus Raul, and it's one of the major challenges right now going on against a state rifle ban and magazine ban, specifically dealing with Illinois' PICA law. So that law bans a long list of commonly owned semi-automatic rifles like AR-15s and AKs, and also bans magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. So earlier in this case, you had Judge McGlynn issue a ruling favorable to the challengers, and he found that Illinois' rifle and magazine ban does in fact violate the Second Amendment. He concluded that these firearms and magazines are commonly owned for lawful purposes and therefore fall within the scope of the constitutional protection. But the 7th Circuit allowed Illinois to continue enforcing the law while their appeal is currently moving forward. The plaintiffs then sought emergency intervention from the Supreme Court, and although the Supreme Court declined to step in, at an interlocutory phase, you did have a statement from Judge Thomas, Justice Thomas, where he said that essentially the time would come soon where the Supreme Court would need to step in, and if Illinois continued to ban the most commonly owned rifles and magazines, the Supreme Court would have to do something. So the pressure was already building, and you had that statement from the Supreme Court, and then this case went to the 7th Circuit and was argued in front of them. And during those arguments, the federal government under the Trump administration also supported the challengers, so they supported striking down these bans, and they argued that Illinois' ban is inconsistent with Bruin and that firearms like AR-15s are protected arms. The judges also appeared skeptical of Illinois trying to relitigate factual findings that were already made by the lower court, and that was kind of the posture of this case as it sits right now. But then the Benson decision happened out of Washington, DC. The plaintiffs in this Barnett case filed a supplemental notice telling the 7th Circuit about Benson and about the DC Court of Appeals and that decision striking down the district's ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. So the importance of Benson is that it directly cuts against one of the most important pillars used by anti-gun states like this one here in Illinois. Benson held that these magazines are protected arms under the Second Amendment because they facilitate armed self-defense and are in common use for lawful purposes, and that they are ubiquitous with that type of use of firearms. So that is a major problem for states defending magazine bans, because once a court recognizes that these magazines are protected arms, commonly possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes, the entire constitutional burden then shifts to the government, and they have to justify this ban using history and tradition. And that is why Illinois is reacting the way that it is. Because if Benson gains traction, then the states here and their position becomes more vulnerable and can be struck down by the court. Not just, their ban on magazines, but also the broader framework of PICA also comes into focus and potentially could also be found unconstitutional. So Illinois responded quickly, and they're trying to stall and essentially limit the impact of Benson on their current case. So first, Illinois says that Benson is just an outlier and not binding on the 7th Circuit. The state tells the court that Benson conflicts with every other appellate court to address these types of magazines, and they say that the 7th Circuit should not depart from its earlier reasoning in the Beavis case. Second, Illinois attacks Benson's basic premise that magazines are protected arms. The state argues that Bruin does not mean that something becomes an arm merely because it facilitates the use of a firearm. In other words, Illinois is trying to preserve the argument that magazines are somehow outside the core of the Second Amendment's protections, or at least can be treated differently from other firearms that are actually designed to operate with those types of magazines. Third, Illinois says that Benson got the common use and historical tradition analysis completely wrong. The state argues that relying on popularity is circular, and they cite to Beavis, and it claims that Benson improperly required historical bans on similarly ubiquitous arms. So they're saying that, Bruen does not require that there be a one-to-one, type of historical analog. They just need something close enough to justify their ban. Illinois also argues that Benson is in tension with the Supreme Court Rahimi principles based, on historical approaches, and they point to other appellate decisions that the state says went the other way and said that these magazine bans are permissible. So that is currently the state's play here in this case. They are not just disagreeing with Benson, they are trying to isolate it before it can actually have damage on this case. And that to me is one of the biggest tells in this filing and also the recent amicus brief that Illinois joined in the Benson case. Because when a state rushes to minimize a new opinion like this one, that usually means it sees risk and they can see the risk that that case will have on the outcome of their challenge. Illinois understands that Benson gives the challengers a cleaner, newer, and more direct appellate ruling against magazine bans. It gives the Seventh Circuit another path that it could follow if they wanted to move away from this whole anti-Second Amendment logic that was put in place in Beavis. And so that is really the real fear here. The fear is not just that Benson exists, the fear is that Benson exposes how unstable the state's position actually is. It highlights the problem with pretending that common use does not matter when millions and millions of these magazines are owned across the nation by law-abiding people for lawful purposes. And it highlights the problem with historical analogs that regulated some dangerous conduct but did not impose this kind of broad sweeping categorical ban on these types of items. So Illinois is trying to get ahead of the Benson impact by saying, just ignore Benson, it's not controlling here, it could be overturned, so just ignore it. Now, another important wrinkle here is the recent procedural development in Benson itself. As we've talked about recently, the Benson court recently denied the expedited petition for en banc panel rehearings, and they also denied the motion to suspend the ruling while that petition is being sought. And that matters because it undercuts the easy fallback argument that states like Illinois love to make, which is just ignore that decision, it might not last, it could get overruled. Instead, Benson currently remains like a real ruling. It has binding effect, on the district there itself, and it can still be cited to because it has not been suspended or overruled or vacated right now. So it's still a good piece of case law that can be pointed to. Yes, it's not binding on the Seventh Circuit, but still the plaintiffs here can point to it as a valid ruling that happened somewhere else. The Benson ruling has not been quickly neutralized. It has not been shoved aside like DC wanted to. The en banc panel there did not agree with them. They did not, just strike it down immediately or put it on hold or get expedited rehearings in that case. Instead, it is still moving forward and it's still good law. So the bottom line essentially in this case is this. The plaintiffs cited to Benson to strengthen their challenge to Illinois' ban on magazines. Illinois responded by trying to discredit Benson as an outlier, arguing that it essentially misread Bruen and misused the common use analysis and broke from Beavis, Rahimi, and other appellate court cases. But the very fact that Illinois felt that it needed to respond so aggressively tells you something about this case. The state sees danger, they see how Benson could impact this current challenge against Pica, and so they're scrambling to try to contain that and prevent Benson from impacting this case as well. So that's what's currently happening. Now we're going to wait to see how the Seventh Circuit responds. As we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.